When a white customer calls security on a black man, he expects appreciation. But what he doesn't know is that the man he's trying to humiliate is a celebrity, and what happens next will leave everyone stunned. The fluorescent lights of the upscale department store flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the rows of luxury items. The silence between aisles seemed almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of clinking hangers and the occasional rustle of fabric. A tall black man, dressed in a well-fitted hoodie and jeans, browsed through the racks with an air of quiet confidence. His eyes scanned the shelves, his fingers brushing over the fabric of a sleek leather jacket. But across the store, near the cash registers, a white man stood, glaring at him from behind a rack of designer scarves. His eyes narrowed as he watched the shopper move, his hand instinctively reaching for the security button under the counter. He was tall, well-dressed in a suit that screamed authority. His lips curled in distaste as he muttered to himself, barely audible. Typical. He turned to the store manager, who was busy arranging a display of handbags. "There's something off about that guy," the white man said, his voice laced with disdain. "I think he's been eyeing my wallet." The manager glanced at the customer, confusion crossing his face. "Sir, are you sure? He doesn't look—" "Call security now," the man interrupted, his tone sharp and demanding. Moments later, two security guards emerged, their heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The black man turned as the guards approached him, their eyes scanning him with suspicion. His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he faced them. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," one of the guards said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "We've received a complaint." A slow smile spread across the black man's face, a glint of something hidden behind his eyes. He crossed his arms, taking in the situation with quiet amusement. "I see," he said, his voice steady, but there was something calculating in the way he spoke. The white man, standing at a distance, watched in satisfaction as the security guards began to question the shopper. He took a step forward, wanting to see the moment when the man would be escorted out. He didn't expect what happened next. The black man took out his phone and typed something quickly, then turned his gaze toward the white man, who was still watching from a distance. Their eyes locked for a brief second, intense, knowing. "Everything's fine," the black man said, his voice suddenly louder, drawing attention from nearby shoppers. "It's just a misunderstanding. I'll handle it." He turned to the security guards and, without another word, gestured toward the white man, his voice now calm but forceful. "Tell your boss who I am, and this won't be necessary." A hush fell over the store as the guards hesitated, confused. The white man's confident posture faltered, but he didn't speak. The black man held the silence for a moment longer, before he pulled up a quick video on his phone. A moment later, the name flashed across the screen. Will Jameson, the name that would shatter the calm air of the store. The guard's eyes widened. The manager's face went pale as they both exchanged uneasy glances. Will Jameson, the celebrity entrepreneur, the man whose face was plastered across magazines, TV shows, and social media. The same man who owned a string of luxury brands, including the store they stood in. The white man's face drained of color, his smug expression replaced with shock and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Will's lips twisted into a small, knowing smile. "Now, if you'd like to make this right, I suggest we skip the security check and have a proper conversation, don't you think?" The tension in the air was palpable. The other customers, sensing something monumental unfolding, began to shift closer, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The rising tension threatened to explode. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a reckoning. And for the white man, the consequences of his actions were only just beginning. The white man's heart raced as he struggled to piece together what was happening. The store's once ordinary atmosphere now felt suffocating, the weight of dozens of eyes drilling into him. His throat tightened as he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice shaky but still tinged with defensiveness. "I didn't know who." "You didn't care who," Will interrupted, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the man's excuses. "You saw what you wanted to see." The white man's jaw clenched, his cheeks reddening as murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. The guards stood frozen, caught between their protocol and the realization of who they had just confronted. The store manager stepped forward cautiously, his hands wringing together. "Mr. Jameson," the manager began, his voice almost pleading. "I had no idea. If I had known, I assure you." Will raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it," he said coolly. His eyes swept the room, noting the crowd's growing size. "Let's not pretend this is about me being a public figure. This could have happened to anyone who looks like me. And I guarantee you wouldn't be scrambling to apologize right now if my name didn't mean something to you." The white man bristled, a flicker of defiance returning to his eyes. "I wasn't being racist," he said, his voice rising, as if volume could mask his guilt. "I was just being cautious. How was I supposed to know that I wasn't a threat?" Will cut in sharply, stepping closer. His calm facade was beginning to crack, revealing the anger simmering just beneath. "You weren't cautious. You were presumptuous. There's a difference." The crowd edged closer, their whispered conversations growing louder. Some pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation. The white man noticed the cameras and paled further, realizing the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Turn those off," he barked, gesturing at the onlookers. "This is private property. You can't just—" "This isn't about you anymore," Will said, his tone colder now. He turned to the guards. "And you too?" You jumped at his word without a second thought. Did either of you stop to think if what he said made sense? The guards looked down, shame creeping onto their faces. One of them finally spoke, his voice low. "We were just following procedure, sir." "No," Will countered. "You were following bias. And if this is your procedure, it needs to change." The tension in the air was electric, the power dynamics shifting further with every word Will spoke. The store manager, desperate to de-escalate, tried to step in again. "Mr. Jameson," he said nervously, "please, let's move this to my office. We can discuss this privately." "Why privately?" Will asked, his voice ringing out. "You weren't concerned about privacy when you called security on me in front of everyone. Why should we hide the aftermath?" The white man opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly out of arguments. His gaze darted to the exit as if considering making a swift retreat, but the crowd was too thick now. He was trapped, forced to confront the consequences of his actions in real time. Will turned back to him, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt louder than anything else in the room. "You wanted to make an example of me. Now you're the example." The white man's hands trembled as the full weight of Will's words sank in. The room seemed to close in around him, the whispers of the crowd growing louder, more pointed. But Will wasn't done. He turned to the store manager, the guards, and finally the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "This is about what happens every day to people who don't have the luxury of being recognized. People who are judged the second they walk into a room, before they've said or done anything. This stops now." The crowd erupted in murmurs again, a mix of agreement and shock. The tension in the air reached a fever pitch, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Will stood tall in the center of it all, his presence commanding, his anger righteous. And yet, the story was far from over. The fallout from this confrontation would ripple far beyond the store walls, with consequences none of them could yet predict. The white man's frustration boiled over as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. He pointed a trembling finger toward the onlookers, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't just record this. This isn't some public spectacle," he yelled, his words cutting through the tense atmosphere like a whip. But the crowd didn't back down. Instead, more phones were raised, capturing every moment. The tide had shifted, and no one seemed willing to look away. A teenager whispered to their friend, "Isn't that Will Jameson, the actor?" The ripple of recognition spread quickly, fueling the tension. Will took a deep breath, his steady demeanor masking the storm raging inside him. He locked eyes with the white man, who now looked both cornered and defiant. "You still don't get it, do you?" Will said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "This isn't about the cameras. This is about you trying to erase what just happened. Like it doesn't matter, like I don't matter. The man flinched as if struck. That's not what I was doing, he snapped, his voice breaking under the weight of the moment. I thought. You thought I didn't belong here, Will interrupted, stepping closer. The gap between them was almost non-existent now, their confrontation an unspoken battle of wills. And you acted on that thought without a second of hesitation. You saw my skin, and you decided you knew my story. The man's face twisted, a mix of embarrassment and anger. I didn't say that. Don't put words in my mouth, he shouted. But his protest felt weak, hollow. Will's jaw tightened. You didn't have to say it. Your actions screamed it. The store manager, still hovering nearby, wiped his sweaty brow and tried to interject. Mr. Jameson, please, this is all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure no harm was meant. Perhaps we can. We'll cut him off with a glare that could have frozen fire. A misunderstanding, he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Do you think that makes it better? Do you think that excuses what just happened here? The manager stammered, unable to find the words. The guards shifted uncomfortably, their postures rigid, as if hoping the ground would swallow them whole. The tension was suffocating now, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. The white man's eyes darted to the exit again, but there was no way out. He was trapped by the truth he had tried to avoid, by the consequences he couldn't escape. Will turned his gaze to the crowd, addressing them now as much as the man in front of him. This is bigger than me, he said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken stories. It's about what we let slide, what we excuse because it's easier than facing the truth. How many more times does this have to happen before we finally say enough? The crowd was silent, hanging on to his every word. Even those who had been indifferent at first now found themselves pulled into the gravity of the moment. The white man's face turned a deeper shade of red. You don't know me, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, but trembling with defiance. You don't know what I've been through. Will raised an eyebrow, his expression both weary and incredulous. You're right. I don't. But I know what you just did. And that says more than any excuse you could give. The man's shoulders slumped as if the weight of the room had finally broken through his defenses. The cameras continued to roll, their silent gaze an unyielding reminder that this wasn't going away. Yet even as the confrontation seemed to crest, the stakes were far from settled. Whispers of legal action buzzed through the crowd. Reporters were already being tagged in social media posts. And somewhere in the chaos, a seed of something even bigger was taking root. A movement, a reckoning, a call to action. The story wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The air was electric with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone in the store. The white man, red-faced and trembling, yelled again, his voice cracking under the pressure. You're twisting this. I didn't mean anything by it. But his words rang hollow, and the crowd didn't seem convinced. Someone in the back murmured, if he didn't mean anything, why call security in the first place? The question hung in the air, unanswered but powerful, as more people nodded in agreement. Will Jameson took a measured step forward, his presence commanding the room. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Intent doesn't erase impact, he said firmly, his voice steady and deliberate. Your mistake could have ended differently if I weren't someone with a platform. What happens to people who don't have that privilege? Do they just become another statistic? Another story swept under the rug? The man shook his head, his movements jerky and panicked. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. It was just a misunderstanding, he shouted, his tone defensive and raw. But as his words echoed off the walls, it was clear they lacked conviction. Will tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. Bigger than it needs to be? Tell me, how small would you prefer it to stay? Small enough to ignore? Small enough to make you feel better about yourself? The store manager, who had been nervously hovering at the edge of the scene, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all take a moment to cool down. This isn't helping anyone. His voice was thin, his attempt to mediate feeble at best. Will turned to the manager, his expression hardening. Cool down? That's your solution? To act like none of this happened? No. You don't get to erase this because it makes you uncomfortable. The crowd buzzed with whispers, their phones still recording every second. The tension was no longer just between Will and the white man. It had rippled out, pulling everyone into its grip. A young woman near the front of the crowd spoke up, her voice shaking but resolute. It's not just him. This kind of thing happens all the time. People just look the other way. The man's eyes darted toward the exit again, but there was no escape from the weight of the moment. I didn't know who you were, he stammered, his voice tinged with desperation. If I'd known. Will's voice cut through like a blade. If you'd known. What? You would have treated me with respect? Dignity? That's not how this works. Respect isn't reserved for people you recognize. It's the bare minimum everyone deserves. The crowd murmured their agreement, the tide of public opinion clearly turning against the man. His face twisted with frustration and embarrassment, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know me, he said again. But this time it was almost a plea. You're right. I don't, Will replied, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. But I know this. Your actions speak louder than anything you can say. And they speak volumes. The man's shoulders sagged under the weight of Will's words. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with anticipation. The crowd wasn't just witnessing a confrontation, they were witnessing a reckoning. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens added another layer of tension. The stakes weren't just personal anymore. They were about to become public, explosive, and inescapable. The walls seemed to close in around the man as he realized there was no way out. Not from the consequences, not from the truth. But as the sirens grew louder, the question hung in the air, unanswered but pressing. What happens next? The man flinched at Will's words, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to muster a response. This isn't fair, he yelled, his voice cracking. You're twisting this into something it's not. The sirens outside were growing louder now, a wailing reminder that the situation was spiraling beyond control. Some of the onlookers exchanged uneasy glances, while others stood resolute, phones still raised to capture every second. Will stepped forward, his calm yet commanding presence filling the space. What's not fair, he said, his tone sharp, is someone being judged by their skin color before they even have a chance to open their mouth. What's not fair is thinking you're entitled to more respect than someone else just because you think you belong here more than they do. The man's face reddened further, his breathing shallow and uneven. You don't know me, he shouted, his voice defensive. You have no idea what my intentions were. Will didn't flinch. Your intentions don't erase the consequences. They don't change the fact that you called security on me because you assumed I didn't belong here. A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement. The young woman from earlier spoke again, louder this time. We see it all the time. People like you thinking you can just call security when you're uncomfortable. But you're not the victim here. The man turned to her, his desperation morphing into anger. You don't know anything about me, he yelled, his voice rising. I didn't do anything wrong. The store manager, visibly sweating now, raised his hands in an attempt to calm the situation. Let's all take a step back, he said, his voice unsteady. The authorities are on their way, and we need to de-escalate. But the manager's words did little to shift the focus. The crowd was transfixed, their attention locked on Will and the man. You didn't do anything wrong? Will repeated, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You had me followed, humiliated, and almost thrown out. All because you made an assumption. And now you want to play the victim? The man opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, his eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, a way out, anything to salvage the situation. Before he could say anything, the sound of the store's automatic doors opening drew everyone's attention. 2 uniformed police officers entered, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. The man's face lit up momentarily, as if believing the officers would validate him. He gestured toward Will with a shaky hand. There he is, he called out. That's the one causing all this. One of the officers frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the man and Will. We received reports of a disturbance, he said, his tone neutral but firm. What's going on here? Will stepped forward, his calm demeanor unwavering. What's going on is that I was falsely accused of shoplifting and had security called on me without cause. All because of this man's prejudice. The officer looked at Will, then at the man, his gaze lingering on the crowd with their phones raised. The weight of the moment was palpable, and the tension in the room was thicker than ever. The man tried again, his voice rising in desperation. I didn't accuse him of anything. I thought he looked suspicious, that's all. And what exactly made me look suspicious? Will asked, his voice cold and precise. The color of my skin? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off, the crowd holding its collective breath. One of the officers exchanged a look with his partner, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about one man's bias. It was about what would happen when the truth was confronted head-on, in front of a crowd, with the world watching. The room buzzed with tension as the police officers stood at the center of the scene, their stern faces scanning the crowd. The man, emboldened by their presence, pointed at Will again. "Ask him," he yelled, his voice shrill and cracking under the weight of his emotions. "Ask him what he's hiding. Why would I call security if there wasn't a reason?" One of the officers, Officer Martinez, stepped forward, her sharp gaze shifting between the man and Will. "Sir," she said to the man, "you need to calm down and explain exactly what happened." The man's confidence faltered slightly under her tone. I thought he looked suspicious," he stammered. "He was acting like he didn't belong here." Officer Martinez turned to Will, her expression neutral but curious. "Sir, is that true? Did anything happen to prompt this?" Will straightened his shoulders, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "No, officer. I was simply shopping. The only thing I did was exist in this store while being black." The statement sent a ripple through the crowd, murmurs of agreement and indignation swelling again. The man's face reddened further, but he said nothing, clearly struggling to justify his actions. The second officer, Officer Grant, gestured toward the store manager. "Do you have cameras? We'll need to see the footage to verify the claims." The manager nodded hastily and motioned for the officers to follow him. As they disappeared toward the back, the man's bravado began to crack. He paced nervously, casting wary glances at the crowd, who were still recording and whispering among themselves. "Let's see how this plays out," Will said, his voice steady but razor-sharp. "The truth has a funny way of revealing itself." Minutes later, the officers returned, their expressions unreadable. The manager followed closely, wringing his hands. Officer Martinez addressed the man directly. "The footage shows Mr. Jameson," she gestured to Will, walking through the store, browsing like any other customer. "There was no suspicious behavior, no theft, nothing that warranted your actions." The man paled, his confidence completely crumbling. "But there must have been something. He was lurking near the high-end items. I thought." "Your thoughts don't justify profiling," Officer Grant interrupted, his voice firm. "You made an assumption based solely on appearance, and you escalated a situation that didn't need escalation." The man's lips trembled, but before he could respond, Officer Martinez continued. "What's more troubling is that your accusations and behavior caused unnecessary distress. This isn't just about misunderstanding. It's about accountability." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then, one voice rang out from the crowd. "Tell them who you are, Will." All eyes turned toward the young woman from earlier, her arms crossed as she stared at Will with a knowing expression. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply, stepping forward. "My name is Will Jameson," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "And I'm an actor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. You might recognize me from the film Legacies Stand or my charity work with underprivileged communities." Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization dawned on their faces. The man's jaw dropped, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Will's tone hardened as he addressed the man directly. "But none of that should matter here. I shouldn't have to be someone famous for my humanity to be respected. You judged me based on nothing more than the color of my skin." The weight of Will's words pressed heavily on the room. The man staggered back, visibly shaken. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The climax reached its boiling point as the crowd, emboldened by Will's revelation, began to voice their support. "This happens too often," one person yelled. "It's about time someone stood up." The man, cornered by the truth and the eyes of the world, faced a moment of reckoning. The police officers exchanged glances, their postures firm but unyielding, as if ready to enforce whatever accountability was necessary. And then, the store's intercom crackled to life. "Attention, shoppers," a calm but firm voice announced. "The situation has been addressed. Please return to your shopping, and thank you for your patience." But the crowd didn't disperse. All eyes remained fixed on the man, the weight of judgment now fully on his shoulders. Will stood tall, unflinching, a beacon of grace and resolve. The moment hung in the air like a held breath, the inevitable fallout poised to shift everything. Whatever came next would be the turning point, for the man, for Will, and for everyone watching. The man stood frozen, his face pale and slack as the weight of Will's words, and the crowd's disapproval, settled over him. His bluster evaporated, leaving only raw embarrassment and a faint tremble in his voice. I didn't realize," he stammered, his excuses trailing off into silence. Will, calm but resolute, held the man's gaze. "It's not about what you meant," he said firmly. "It's about the harm you caused." The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier tension shifting into a collective sense of vindication. A woman in the front stepped forward and clapped slowly, deliberately, and soon others joined in. Their applause a show of solidarity and admiration for Will's composure and courage. Officer Martinez turned to the man. "Sir, you're free to leave, but I'd suggest you take this as an opportunity to reflect on your actions. Discrimination has no place here, or anywhere." The man hesitated, his lips twitching as if he wanted to argue, but the weight of the crowd's judgment silenced him. With a faint nod, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped under the pressure of shame. Will exhaled deeply, the tension in his body easing as the man disappeared from sight. A few people from the crowd approached him, offering words of support and gratitude for standing up to the injustice they had witnessed. "Thank you," one woman said, her eyes glistening. "What you said, it needed to be heard." Will gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for speaking up when it mattered. Change doesn't happen unless we all stand together." As the crowd began to disperse, the store manager approached Will hesitantly. "Mr. Jameson, I can't apologize enough for what happened here today. Please, let us make this right." Will shook his head gently. "This isn't just about me. Make sure your policies and training prevent things like this from happening again. That's how you make it right." The manager nodded, his expression earnest. "I'll see to it." Will turned to the young woman who had recognized him earlier. "Thank you for having my back," he said with genuine warmth. She shrugged with a grin. "Figured you didn't need the help, but I couldn't let that slide." "You're an inspiration, Will." As he left the store, Will felt a profound sense of resolve. The incident had been painful and unnecessary, but it had also created a moment of reckoning, for the man, for the store, and for everyone who had witnessed it. Outside, the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the day's turmoil giving way to a peaceful evening. Will paused and looked around, feeling a surge of determination. One step at a time, he muttered to himself. The story spread quickly, the videos and posts from witnesses going viral online. Comments poured in, some praising Will for his grace under pressure, others expressing outrage at the blatant discrimination. The incident sparked conversations about bias and accountability, creating ripples far beyond the store's walls. For Will, the event was a reminder of how far there was still to go, but also of the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. He knew he wouldn't stop speaking out, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. And as he walked away, head held high, he hoped the man, and everyone watching, had learned an invaluable lesson. Respect and dignity aren't privileges, they're rights. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more thought-provoking and powerful tales, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Follow us for more inspiring content that challenges perspectives and sparks conversations. Let's make a difference together.